Authorities and local residents across the rugged Arizona frontier are still grappling with the strange and unexpected chain of events that began with what seemed like a simple act of kindness. According to early reports and testimonies gathered from nearby settlers, a quiet rancher known for keeping to himself found his life abruptly altered after assisting an injured Apache woman along a remote trail. While many frontier stories begin with conflict or confrontation, this one began with compassion, and that compassion soon spiraled into something much more complex and deeply unsettling. Multiple sources confirm that the rancher, identified locally as a solitary man who had lived peaceably for years, was traveling the narrow, winding stretch that cuts across Red Canyon Pass when he stumbled upon the injured woman. The trail, known to be treacherous even in the best weather, had the reputation of catching travelers off guard with loose rock, unexpected drops, and sudden shifts in the wind that could send horses rearing. Locals stated that most riders avoided it unless absolutely necessary, but the rancher used it frequently due to its direct connection to the grazing lands he managed. Witnesses who spoke with him afterward said he described the moment he came across the woman as a shock that stopped the world. She was lying partially hidden near a rock outcrop, her clothing torn, her braids dusty and tangled, and her breathing shallow. It was obvious she had been struggling for some time. What struck him the most, however, was not the severity of her injury, but the expression of fierce determination in her eyes, an expression that made it clear she was not a person accustomed to showing weakness, even now. Instead of turning away or riding to safety as some might in fear of tribal tensions, the rancher dismounted and offered help. He later told a neighbor he didn't think twice, that it was instinctive, the same instinct that had driven him to rescue injured livestock or injured travelers in the past. Decades ago, such an encounter might have been treated with suspicion or escalating aggression. But times were changing, and many frontier families had learned that the Apache tribes were not simply the fearsome threat they had been portrayed as in campfire tales. They were individuals, families, protectors of their land, many of whom were trying to navigate the same harsh environment as everyone else. Still, the rancher knew the risks. Helping a member of the Apache people could be perceived as interference, intrusion, or even offense. The tribes had suffered deep injustices, broken agreements, and forced relocations, making interactions with settlers delicate and unpredictable. But he also understood that no moral code, no law written or unwritten, could justify leaving an injured woman to die alone on a canyon trail. So he helped her stand, supported her weight, and guided her back toward his cabin where she could rest safely until she regained her strength. Neighbors later revealed that the rancher had spent hours tending to her injuries, preparing herbs, heating water, and offering food even though she barely touched it. She spoke little and observed everything, her eyes scanning the cabin and the horizon through its small windows. Though no words were exchanged between them beyond gestures of gratitude and caution, the atmosphere was described as one of unspoken understanding. Two strangers bound not by culture, language, or background, but by the fragile circumstances of survival. That evening, reports say, she slipped away before dawn. She left no tracks, no visible sign of her departure beyond the neatly folded blanket she had used. The rancher found the cabin empty when he awoke. He assumed she had returned to her people and believed the incident had come to an end. He expected no repayment, no confrontation, no repercussions. To him, it had simply been the right thing to do, and life was meant to move on. But by midday, everything changed. When the rancher stepped outside to fetch water from the well, he noticed something that froze him where he stood, a strange mark carved deep into the wood of his front door. It was not a random symbol, nor was it the work of vandals. The mark was deliberate, precise, and recognizable to anyone who had lived near Apache territory long enough to learn the meaning behind such signs. Neighbors who later rushed to the ranch after hearing of the marking described it as striking and unmistakable, a tribal sign that could mean protection, warning, ownership, judgment, or debt, depending on the context. The rancher stared at the mark for several minutes, trying to interpret its message. It was carved clean and sharp, indicating it had been made recently, likely within the hour. But what unsettled him was not the symbol itself. It was the realization that someone had approached his cabin so quietly that not even his horse had stirred. Some claimed that the sign meant the woman he helped belonged to a prominent family within the tribe. Others suggested it was a mark recognizing his act of kindness. But a few whispered more ominous interpretations, hinting that the rancher might have involved himself in tribal matters he did not understand. Local newspapers began reporting on the bizarre occurrence within days, framing it as a frontier mystery with ties to cultural traditions few settlers had ever encountered firsthand. Some speculated it might evolve into conflict, others believed it could signify the beginning of a rare alliance. But everyone agreed on one thing. The rancher's quiet life had been permanently altered in ways even he could not predict. Officials in the nearest town acknowledged the event but offered little commentary, urging settlers not to make assumptions about what the sign might mean. Tribal interpreters declined to speak on record, adding even more intrigue to the growing public curiosity. Meanwhile, the rancher stayed mostly silent, tending to his daily work while living under the shadow of the mark carved into the door, an ever-present reminder that what he had done was seen, acknowledged, and not to be forgotten. As news spread across the frontier, more questions emerged than answers. Why had the woman been injured on the trail? Who carved the mark on the rancher's door? And perhaps most unsettling of all, was the sign a promise, a warning, or something far more serious? Whatever its meaning, one thing became clear to everyone following the story. The rancher had stepped unknowingly into a chain of events far bigger than himself, and the days ahead would reveal just how significant his decision to help that woman. Authorities confirmed early this morning that the mysterious carving found on the rancher's door was not a random act of vandalism, but a highly specific Apache tribal mark, one historically used only in situations involving debt, warning, or protection. The revelation immediately intensified the investigation, drawing the attention of historians, tribal representatives, and federal authorities who were already monitoring tensions in the region. What had initially appeared to be a simple incident involving an injured Apache woman rescued on a lonely trail was rapidly evolving into a complex web of cultural significance, historical weight, and potential conflict, and investigators were trying to determine whether the rancher was being targeted, honored, or claimed. Neighbors reported seeing unfamiliar riders in the area the previous night, moving silently along ridge lines and disappearing into tree cover before anyone could determine their intentions. Some residents believed they were watching the early signs of a territorial response, while others worried it might escalate into retaliation if the tribe believed the rancher had interfered in matters beyond his comprehension. Yet the rancher himself insisted that all he had done was help a wounded woman, no different from how he would have helped anyone, regardless of background. He described her as scared, exhausted, and clearly in need of immediate aid. He emphasized that he had not asked questions, made demands, or attempted to detain her. He simply offered bandages, water, shelter, and a promise that she would not be harmed. That, he believed, was the end of the story. But the carving on the door suggested otherwise. Cultural experts interviewed by investigators explained that the mark resembled an older Apache emblem rarely seen in modern times, one connected to ancestral traditions involving protection of life and repayment of moral debts. According to these specialists, such a symbol might indicate that the tribe considered the rancher now tied to them in some form, perhaps safeguarded by their warriors, or perhaps watched to ensure he upheld a responsibility. Yet interpretations varied widely. Some historians argued the mark signified that the woman belonged to a lineage of significance and that her rescue would not be treated as a simple act of kindness but a binding event. Others proposed the opposite, that the mark was a warning for outsiders not to interfere further. The lack of consensus only deepened the mystery, pushing authorities to seek official input from the tribal council. However, communication between the local sheriff's office and tribal leadership had historically been difficult. Decades of tension, land disputes, unaddressed grievances, and jurisdictional disagreements had widened the divide. Now, with the appearance of an ancient tribal symbol on a non-native man's home, both sides found themselves thrust into an uneasy proximity. The sheriff acknowledged in a morning briefing that the situation required sensitivity, knowledge, and caution. The tribal elders, he noted, were the only ones who could clarify the meaning of the mark and whether it indicated danger, gratitude, or something else entirely. But the elders had not yet responded. They had instead requested time to convene and remain quiet until the meaning of the event could be properly understood. Their silence, though respectful in cultural terms, caused anxiety among those outside the tribe who did not understand Apache traditions and feared the worst. Meanwhile, word of the event spread rapidly across nearby towns, sparking speculation, rumors, and heated debate. Some residents believed the rancher was now under the tribe's protection and that the carving was a sign of appreciation for honoring an injured woman in a moment of need. Others argued the mark meant the tribe would return, possibly aggressively, and that the rancher had accidentally stepped into a long-standing cultural boundary he could not comprehend. The divide in public opinion created an atmosphere of uncertainty, with some community members offering support to the rancher while others kept their distance, wary of becoming entangled in whatever consequences might follow. The rancher himself remained calm, but deeply reflective. He admitted to investigators that he had never expected a simple act of human decency to lead to such attention, suspicion, or cultural entanglement. He recalled how the woman trembled when he found her, how she tried to push herself up despite clearly being in pain, and how she eyed the surrounding terrain as though expecting danger to appear at any moment. He remembered the way she relaxed, just slightly, when she realized he meant her no harm. For him, that moment alone justified helping her. But now, with the unexplained symbol carved into his door, the rancher wondered whether the tribe viewed his assistance as more significant than he had realized. Federal authorities, particularly those specializing in tribal relations, began coordinating with local investigators to avoid misinterpretation or escalation. Their priority was to prevent the situation from turning into a cultural conflict rooted in misunderstanding. They emphasized that symbols in indigenous traditions often carried layers of meaning unfamiliar to outsiders, and that hasty assumptions could prove disastrous. At the same time, they acknowledged that the appearance of such a rare marking would not have been done lightly. It represented intention, whether protective or cautionary, honoring or demanding, and determining which meaning applied was now the central focus of the investigation. Sociologists also weighed in, explaining that indigenous communities historically used symbols to communicate boundaries, alliances, debts, and warnings without relying on written language. These symbols acted as agreements or messages encoded in ways that only those raised within the culture fully understood. The symbol carved onto the rancher's door, therefore, might be delivering a message intended not for him, but for the tribe's own people. Investigators began considering whether the carving was a communication between tribal members rather than directed at the rancher himself. The idea that the rancher may simply be the bearer of a message meant for others added an additional layer of complexity to the case. Amid the uncertainty, one detail stood out. There were no signs of aggression. The carving was made with precision, not force. No property was damaged beyond the symbol itself, no threatening messages accompanied it, and no hostile encounters had taken place. Whatever the tribe intended, it did not appear to be an act of violence. Instead, the mark seemed deliberate, ceremonial, and deeply rooted in cultural tradition. As local experts continued analyzing the carving, they suggested that the symbol's placement, directly on the rancher's front door, might denote crossing into his life rather than merely issuing a directive. The act carried significance, hinting that the tribe acknowledged what he had done and now recognized him in return. The investigation intensified as authorities prepared for a meeting with tribal leaders, hoping their insight would finally clarify the meaning. Until then, the rancher remained unknowingly positioned at the center of a cultural riddle that spanned generations. And the injured woman he had helped, whose origin and status were still unknown, held the key to everything. Authorities reported that what happened in the hours following the discovery of the strange mark on the rancher's cabin door transformed the incident from a curious mystery into a developing story that drew the attention of tribal representatives, local law enforcement, and historians specializing in Apache cultural symbols. The rancher, who had already been under quiet observation for assisting the injured Apache woman the previous evening, found himself at the center of conversations he had never expected to take part in. He remained calm but concerned, knowing that the carved symbol was not the act of a vandal or mischievous trespasser. It had been made with deliberate intention and knowledge, and that alone meant the situation was far more complex. In the early hours of the morning, a thin layer of frost still clinging to the ground, Deputy Roland arrived to take photographs, ask questions, and investigate the perimeter. The deputy's voice, though professional, held a tension that was hard to ignore. He had worked in the region for decades and understood enough about the surrounding communities to recognize that the mark carried weight. He understood that it signaled neither hostility nor friendship until its meaning was confirmed, but it was enough to change the atmosphere of the ranch. As he walked around the cabin, he noted there were no footprints leading away except for the rancher's and the tracks of the horse belonging to the injured woman. This meant the carving had likely been done shortly after she departed or by someone who had approached carefully and without hesitation. The rancher followed along, explaining the encounter from the previous day in full detail. He did not embellish or dramatize. He simply recounted how he had found the woman slumped beside her wagon, bleeding and dizzy, and how he had taken her inside, bandaged her wound, and offered water and shelter. The deputy listened closely, asking for clarifications but never interrupting the flow of the story. When the rancher described how the woman insisted on leaving before night fully settled, the deputy nodded slowly. He, like many locals, knew that tribal members often chose to return to their own camps rather than remain with outsiders, even when injured, if they felt safe enough to travel. As the conversation continued, a representative from a local Apache Cultural Liaison office arrived on horseback, her expression unreadable but her posture steady. She introduced herself politely, acknowledging both the deputy and the rancher before examining the carved mark with careful eyes. Her fingertips hovered over the wood, not touching it directly as a sign of respect. After several silent moments, she leaned back and exhaled in a manner that signaled comprehension rather than alarm. She explained that the symbol was not a threat, though it carried a seriousness that should not be dismissed. It represented recognition, an acknowledgement that the rancher's actions the previous day had affected not just one woman but the broader community. She elaborated cautiously, making clear that such marks were rarely used in modern times. They were typically reserved for identifying someone who had shown unexpected honor or assistance in circumstances where a tribal member's life was endangered. It was not an invitation and not a warning. It was a statement that the man living in the cabin had acted with integrity at a critical moment. The rancher listened with humility, though he confessed he felt unworthy of such recognition. He had simply done what any decent human being would have done. He had helped someone who needed help. The liaison nodded at his remarks, stating gently that while many people claimed they would help, fewer acted quickly and without hesitation. She explained that the mark would not be removed or altered because it was not meant for him alone. It was meant for anyone who might pass through, a sign of acknowledgement within a wider cultural lexicon, something the rancher did not need to fully understand to respect. As more community members learned of the incident, discussions began circulating among both locals and tribal groups. Some saw the mark as a positive reminder of cooperation between communities historically divided by misunderstandings. Others worried that the rancher might become entangled in matters he did not fully grasp. And yet, despite these differing opinions, the majority agreed that the event was significant. It symbolized an intersection of cultures, one shaped by compassion rather than conflict, and it brought attention to enduring traditions many believed had been forgotten. Throughout the day, the rancher continued his usual work but remained aware of every sound, every breeze, and every figure approaching along the horizon. He wasn't frightened. He simply felt the weight of responsibility. He realized that the woman he helped had not only trusted him in her moment of vulnerability, but had allowed her community to recognize his actions in the way they deemed appropriate. He felt honored, perplexed, and deeply reflective. He questioned whether he had done enough and what might happen next. In the afternoon, the liaison returned, this time with a small satchel and a message. Inside was an herbal salve, meant as a gift, traditionally offered in gratitude. She made clear that the woman he had helped was recovering well and wished for the rancher to accept the gesture. The salve itself was symbolic rather than practical. Though useful, its greater purpose was to convey respect. The rancher accepted it with sincerity and thanked the liaison for the update. He felt a sense of peace knowing the woman was healing. As night approached, the incident began to spread through regional newspapers and radio updates, not in sensational tones, but as a thoughtful reflection of rural life and the rare but meaningful moments of interconnectedness that still surfaced in isolated areas. Reporters emphasized the historic nature of the mark, explaining its origins and cultural significance. They highlighted the growing conversations about mutual respect, cooperation, and understanding between communities that had often lived parallel but separate lives. The rancher listened to the news quietly that evening, seated at his table with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. He was aware that he had not done anything extraordinary by his own standards, yet the world around him seemed to be treating his actions differently. He thought of the woman again, imagining her sitting by a fire somewhere, recovering, perhaps telling her own version of the story. He wondered if she knew about the mark placed on his door or if she had been the one to carve it herself before heading home. He would likely never know, but he felt no need for answers. What mattered, he decided, was that he had acted out of humanity, and the world had responded in a language both ancient and profound. And though the story was still unfolding, he sensed that something had shifted permanently, not just on his doorframe, but in the way he viewed his place within the land he lived on. Authorities confirmed that the events unfolding around the rancher were no longer viewed as isolated or coincidental. What began as an act of kindness toward an injured Apache woman had evolved into a complex situation involving cultural signals, territorial misunderstandings, and unexpected political undertones between tribal leaders and local settlers. Investigators reported that the strange mark carved into the rancher's cabin door was not random vandalism, but a deliberate message, a traditional Apache sign used only in situations involving protection, debt, or territorial claim. Experts in indigenous symbolism noted that such a mark was rarely used lightly and almost never used without deeper purpose. The rancher had found himself at the center of something far more significant than he had imagined. The woman he had helped, who remained unnamed in official releases out of respect for tribal privacy, had been located by her people the night after the incident. Though still recovering, she had spoken to tribal elders about the rancher who had found her injured along the trail and carried her to shelter despite the dangers of approaching darkness and the rising cold. Her account described him as respectful, gentle, and cautious, traits the elders later admitted were uncommon in encounters between settlers and tribal members during times of tension. Her testimony prompted the tribe to send a group to his cabin, though officials emphasized that this was done not as a threat, but as a form of acknowledgement. However, while the intention may have been respectful, the method, quiet, sudden, and unexpected, had left the rancher terrified. The community surrounding the ranch began to speculate wildly as more details emerged. Some locals believed the symbol carved on his door meant danger or imminent retaliation. Others insisted it meant gratitude or even protection. A few suggested it could be a summons, a call for the rancher to present himself to the tribal council. But in truth, only the elders themselves understood its full meaning, and so far, they had chosen not to reveal it. This ambiguity placed the rancher in a state of emotional suspension. He continued his daily routine with caution, avoiding unnecessary travel, securing his livestock earlier each night, and staying close to his daughter, who sensed her father's unease though he tried not to show it. Reporters who visited the ranch described the atmosphere as surprisingly still, as though the land itself were holding its breath. Though neighbors offered help, the rancher politely declined, insisting he did not want anyone else drawn into a situation they didn't fully understand. He remained practical and level-headed, even while admitting privately that the sight of the carved mark made him feel as if the eyes of an entire people were silently watching him. He had no hostility toward the Apache community, only uncertainty, for he had no guidance about what they wanted from him or what they expected him to do next. Authorities attempted to arrange communication between both parties, hoping to prevent any misunderstanding that could escalate tensions. When contact was finally established, a small delegation of Apache representatives agreed to meet with local officials to clarify the meaning of the mark. But before that meeting occurred, a surprising development unfolded. According to sources close to the tribe, the injured woman, whose recovery had been slow but steady, had specifically requested to speak with the rancher again. This request alone shifted the narrative and reframed public perception of the situation. It became clear that the mark was indeed connected to her, though the exact nature of the connection remained vague. Tribal elders stated only that it was a message of significance, one that acknowledged the rancher's action in saving her life. Still, they refrained from explaining more, which deepened the sense of mystery surrounding the event. The rancher, for his part, remained humble. He reiterated in interviews that he had acted according to his conscience and upbringing, not expecting repayment or recognition. He expressed genuine concern that his gesture may have unintentionally caused cultural disruption, stating that if he had known helping her would lead to this level of attention, he would still have done the same thing. Despite his calm demeanor, those closest to him noticed his growing anxiety. He slept lightly and kept his rifle within reach, though he had no intention of using it unless forced to. He was not afraid of the Apache people themselves, only of misunderstanding and the possibility of conflict arising from something he had not fully grasped. He often stood outside his cabin at night, staring at the carved symbol that glowed faintly in the moonlight, wondering what responsibility had been placed on him without his consent. Then, as community speculation reached its peak, a new statement was released from tribal representatives. They explained that the mark carved on the door was not one of danger, but one of honor. It meant that the rancher had been recognized as someone who had shown extraordinary respect to a woman of the tribe during a vulnerable moment. The symbol also meant that the tribe owed him a debt of protection, not payment, not allegiance, but acknowledgement. Such a designation was rare and reserved only for situations involving life-saving acts rendered without expectation of reward. This revelation changed the tone of public conversation instantly. Where before the rancher had been seen as a man under threat, he was now considered someone who had unexpectedly forged a connection between two worlds often divided by tension. Reporters described him as a bridge between cultures, a man who acted out of conscience rather than fear or pride. Community members who had once whispered anxiously now spoke admiringly. Neighbors brought food, shook his hand, and offered support. Yet the rancher himself felt no sense of heroism. Instead, he felt humbled and slightly overwhelmed. He did not know what it meant to be marked with a symbol of honor by a group whose traditions were older than the land itself. He wondered whether he now held responsibilities he had never asked for. But above all, he wished only for peace. He wanted reassurance that there would be no lingering misunderstandings, no expectations he could not fulfill. What mattered to him most was that the injured woman had recovered and that her people did not see him as a threat. When officials announced that the woman would soon meet with him again, the rancher felt a mix of relief and apprehension. He knew that conversation with her, however brief, would likely clarify everything. He hoped she would tell him why the mark had been placed on his door, why her people had stood outside his cabin that night, and what it meant for his future. And though he feared hearing something he was unprepared to accept, he also sensed that whatever came next would finally give him peace of mind. The carved mark remained exactly where it had been placed, bold, clear, and impossible to ignore. But now, instead of fear, it stirred curiosity and respect. For the first time since the incident, the rancher slept without waking in the middle of the night to check the windows. The land no longer felt suspended in tension. It felt as though the story was moving toward an answer, one carried by the woman whose life he had saved. In the days following the incident, the quiet homestead that had once held only the rancher's solitary routines became a place watched closely by both local authorities and curious residents who had heard fragments of the story. Word traveled as it always did in rural communities, not through headlines first, but through whispers, retellings, and the subtle awe that came from people realizing how quickly a simple act of kindness had spiraled into something far larger than any of them could have predicted. The mark left on the rancher's door had become a source of speculation, interpreted as a warning, a message of gratitude, or perhaps a summons from a community that operated by its own rules far removed from those of the settlers. What no one else knew was that the rancher himself felt a strange mix of unease and responsibility every time he looked at that carved symbol. He had saved the injured woman because it was what any decent human being should do, not because he sought recognition or wished to involve himself in Apache affairs. Yet the message left behind suggested that his actions had not gone unnoticed, not by the woman and not by those who watched over her. He wondered if the mark meant the tribe expected something from him, or if it simply acknowledged that he was no longer just an isolated rancher living on the edge of their world. Perhaps, in their eyes, he had crossed a threshold without realizing it. He replayed the moment he had found her, alone, hurt, frightened, and understood now that she had been running from something far more dangerous than he had imagined. As he tried to go about his normal work, his mind kept returning to the possibility that she had been marked by conflict, by internal divisions within her nation, or by something deeper he could not yet understand. If the mark on his door was connected to whatever she carried with her, then it was possible that danger could return, not just for her, but for him as well. Yet when he spoke with his closest neighbors, all they saw was the surface of the story, a man who had offered help, a tribe that had responded in a way no outsider fully comprehended, and a gesture that would likely be analyzed far more than the rancher wished. Some offered caution, others offered admiration. A few privately questioned whether he had endangered himself by becoming involved in something he could never truly belong to. But beneath their words was another tone, one of respect, because even in a harsh frontier world, there was something universally honorable about risking one's own safety to save another as more days passed. The rancher began to sense that this was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a chapter that neither he nor the woman had chosen. He found himself watching the tree line more frequently, listening for unfamiliar sounds, noticing small shifts in the landscape that might have escaped his attention before. He didn't know if the tribe intended to return, or if the message carved on his door would simply remain as a silent reminder of the moment their paths crossed. Even so, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being observed, not with malice, but with scrutiny, as if unseen eyes were judging his character, measuring whether the kindness he had shown was an isolated incident or a reflection of a deeper truth within him. And though he couldn't articulate why, he felt strangely at peace with that, because something about the woman's quiet strength, even in her pain, had shown him a glimpse of a world built on loyalty, honor, and survival. A world he now felt connected to, whether he wanted to be or not. Whatever happened next, the rancher understood that the mark on his door was not meant to frighten him. It was a sign that someone remembered what he had done, and that, in ways he could not yet foresee, the story was far from over.